all behavior serves a purpose. I think that we sometimes get trapped in this problem behavior must exist for some unknown reason that we can't solve, and we try to make it very complicated. But every behavior we engage in, whether it's appropriate or inappropriate in the social context, serves a purpose for what we're doing. And all behavior is learned. It becomes reinforced, and that pattern of reinforcement maintains that behavior over time, or it becomes punished and we stop learning that behavior or doing that behavior. So when we think about challenging behaviors that might exist in charge or really in any population, we need to think about behaviors communication. All behaviors are learned, and all behaviors serve a purpose. And really, behavior is an interaction that involves the environment. So you see this in kids all the time, in that their behavior changes based on what environment they're in. They might have wonderful behavior at school, but come home and have miserable behavior with their family. That might be reversed. They might be a child who always has wonderful behavior in most settings, but the environment helps to influence the impact of that behavior or reinforce that behavior. And when we think about something like pain, our body is considered a part of our environment. So what I often hear is that folks like behavior analysts or folks who think from a behavioral viewpoint aren't considering pain or these other sources of impact from the body, and that's ill-advised. Actually, they're very concerned about what's happening within the body and to the body in that environment, and a painful experience inside of us is still a part of our environment that impacts our day-to-day. And so it might be difficult to pick that up in some situations because your behavior may look very different depending on the context or environment that you're in. But one of the first things we want to do when we consider pain is consider, is this a behavior that is simply changing as a result of the environment that we're in, or is this a behavior that's occurring in multiple contexts of the environment? So, for example, if a child were to engage in no problem behavior at home, come to school, engage in no problem behavior, but the moment math is presented to them in class, you see a spike in problem behavior. And let's say that's at 1 p.m. If that child is repeatedly tracked with data, every time that 1 p.m. hits, we see an elevation of behavior, that's not likely a painful experience. That's likely a result of the environment, which is, I don't want to do the math and I want to try to get away from this, so I elevate my behavior to get away from that. But if there was truly a painful situation that was a chronic or persistent pain, you would tend to see that at home, on the commute to school, while at school, and throughout the school day that might look very different than what their average school day would look like. So again, we have to think about the environmental context and how the body would change as a result of that. Now, if I'm highly distracted doing something I really love, maybe I'll kind of forget about that painful experience a little bit. But when those activities dissipate and I'm sort of re-reminded of this painful experience that's happening inside of me, you might see those behaviors elevate. So we have to kind of tease apart some of those things in the environment, and sometimes a good behavioral specialist can come in and help us do that. So when we want to break down the basics of why any behavior happens, whether it's a challenging behavior or a behavior that we love and we hope all kids do, we have to think about why behavior happens. And so what's the function of that behavior? And we make things much more complicated when we try to say why a child did something or why we as adults do something. It really boils down to, we want to get access to something or we want to escape something. So I might want to get access to tangible items, things that I can hold and touch and have. Maybe it's my tablet. Maybe it is my video game. Maybe it is my favorite candy that I love. But I want to get access to that thing that I can hold and have a tangible product with me. I might also want to get access to social attention from somebody, whether that's my classmates, whether that's my parent or teacher. It might even be my nurse at a hospital. We all want social attention. That's why we have partnerships and relationships and those types of things. So to get access to that. Another area we might want to get access to is internal stimulation, things that make us feel better. Our other function of behavior outside of access to something is to escape something we don't like or something that we might find aversive. So I might want to escape a tangible item. I might want to escape that math worksheet that was just presented in front of me, or you gave me a meal that I really don't like and I want to escape that tangible product. I might want to escape attention. All right, and then another area we might want to escape is internal stimulation. This is where pain comes into the picture. So I might want to escape this feeling of pain or this itch on my body, and by doing something, I'm able to escape that. So if I had a bug bite on my arm and I went and itched that, I'm escaping that feeling of that bug bite being there. So it's really valuable that when we think about the functions of behavior for any behavior at all, are we trying to gain access to something, or are we trying to escape something? And once we can start thinking about that, we can think about replacement behaviors that are more appropriate for that. So another way to break this down, you might be able to see on our next slide here, are the functions of behavior. So again, traveling down the left side of that chart, I might want to obtain preferred environmental events. So that might be preferred preferred activities or items like toys, food, or money. And I'm able to gain that by positive or tangible or edible reinforcement. I might also want to gain access to social attention, like we mentioned, pats on the backs, smiles and laughter, praise from my parents. That all makes me feel really good and is highly reinforcing for my behavior. We call that positive social reinforcement. I might also engage in that behavior for reprimands or inappropriate stares or looks. And I might engage in those things as a way to get access still to attention. So maybe my social behavior isn't as sophisticated or as mature in that setting, or maybe I found the only time people in this environment pay attention to me is when I engage in these reprimands or seek reprimands from others. And that is still access to social attention. And we sometimes confuse that with thinking we're actually punishing the child by giving them reprimands, but really we're engaging in positive social reinforcement. And anytime we use reinforcement, that means that pattern of behavior is going to keep coming back. If you then travel down the right-hand side of that chart, you're going to see escape, avoid, or unpreferred environmental events. So here we're going to want to get away from non-preferred activities or items like a difficult assignment. I might try to escape transitions or events that are coming next that I don't prefer to go to. And I might also try to escape changes in my routine. And I find this very common in charge that we don't like having big disruptions in our schedule. I think a part of that is related to the fact that because of their multisensory impairments, so much of their day is what we control and move them through. And they don't get much of a choice in what their schedule looks like and being prepared for changes in the schedule. They might not have enough tools in their environment because of those multisensory impairments to be able to know what expectations are coming next. So when they have felt like they've established that and we take those expectations away, you might see resistance to that and a way to escape that situation. So think about that in terms of we have all kinds of cues in our environment. I can look at the clock on the wall to know when my transition is going to be over. You might look at your watch right now and go, how much longer is Kasee going to talk about this topic? Those are all very easy cues in our environment that our visual sense allows us to know what expectations are coming next and when something might be finished. And if individuals with charge don't have those same expectations, their instinct might be to escape that situation to something that they know they can predict in their environment. And that could elicit inappropriate behavior. And then lastly, if we look at that internal stimulation, that's where we talk about hunger, pain, or itching. And that's negative automatic reinforcement. That's a way for us to immediately fix something internally to us to make ourselves feel better. So as I described that bug bite, but pain is one of those areas that, as we've spent much of this presentation discussing, might be an area that a child or individual with charge is trying to escape from that experience, and as a byproduct of that may demonstrate behavior that we feel is atypical, but it's strictly a way for them to be able to escape that internal stimulation that's uncomfortable for them. So when we also see other problem behaviors and challenging behaviors like that aggression and self-injury or disruptive behaviors in the environment, some other things we want to consider is the environment even set up to be successful? Are there visual schedules? Are there routines? Are there outcomes that this individual knows what the expectations are for this setting? And oftentimes I find that when we see challenging behaviors arise, is we've told a child or an individual what not to do, but we haven't set up the expectations of what we want them to do in that environment. And those things alone could prevent future problem behaviors. Have we reasonably accommodated their vision and hearing loss? We need to know what the multisensory impairments are for that individual with charge, and not assume that if you had one student or patient with charge that the other one's going to look the exact same way. There's a high variance in the medical complications in this population. So we need to make sure that this is individualized and that we're taking into account how do we best present information auditorily, visually, and to the senses that work best for them. We also want to keep in mind that self-regulation is a very difficult thing for individuals with charge. I do think that when individuals with charge are stressed and are feeling like they can't escape from situations that are stressful or concerning for them, that we see a loss of self-regulation. And this is very difficult because they may not be able to maintain that regulation as long. But when we have a complete loss of regulation, now we're having a full meltdown or a full crying or a full, what folks might describe as a tantrum, even for an adult, it's very difficult to regulate that back down to homeostasis and be calm. And so we want to think about, are there ways in our environment we could prevent that stressful experience from happening in the first place? Another area that I had touched on is that we tend to see a spike in repetitive behaviors when a child is distressed, and pain could be one part of that distress, but it could just be that my schedule's changed, or you were a new teacher, or I had a different nurse 5 minutes ago and now you're here. Those changes, if they're not predictable for that individual with charge or given a clear expectation of what those changes will be, I see a spike in repetitive behaviors. And I believe that's a result of the spike in anxiety that they feel and the uncertainty of what's coming next, which if we could then on the front end anticipate what those could be for that individual, we can put in place preventative aspects so we are not spiking that anxiety. And that could be as simple as letting the child know when there's going to be a change in healthcare providers or a change in teachers, or at home when we have a set schedule for Saturday, but we have to make a change to do some other event, by prepping them using visual schedules, using picture schedules, any way that that child can know these expectations ahead of time and what our expectations are for their behavior before we enter into those other environments. So we have had some investigations that have looked at challenging behavior with charge, and we do know that that this is a common problem. And pain, I think, is one part of that piece of why challenging behaviors develop. But we see that they prefer certain items or toys. They have restricted range of interests. I think a part of this is just by natural byproduct of what they've been exposed to in their environment, and maybe haven't had as much exposure to other things, given some of their limitations, their hospital stays, perhaps restrictive school placements. We do see that there might be high levels of sensation seeking, and perhaps you might even see that in self-injurious behavior, that it actually starts very aggressively with injury to the body or to the self than it does even a slow build. And that's where I get concerned about the painful experience that might have elevated that, or that we were missing cues for their bids for attention in the environment first. But we do have some concern that there could be some executive dysfunctioning or regulatory disorders in charge, and that might have developed from some of their very early painful experiences, and that could be one contributing factor. But this is certainly an area that we know exists based on discussions with families and based on watching children over a prolonged period of time as they age who have charge. But we have a lot of work to do in investigating precisely why this might happen, but also what we can do to support individuals with charge if these are truly dysfunctions or disorders that are comorbid with their diagnosis. So again, future research that we should be focusing on. So how do we deal with challenging behavior when it does arrive? So one of the things we want to think about is all behavior is communication. All behavior is a very clear, precise, purposeful way of saying, I want to get access to something or I want to get away from something. And once we start looking at the environment and considering why this behavior would occur and what events surround that individual in that environment, it can be pretty easy to actually start to detect why a child is or an adult is engaging in a behavior that we don't suspect to be appropriate for that setting. So first of all, I think it's invaluable if you work with an individual with charge and you're seeing challenging behaviors or behaviors that you wish you could teach other skills instead as replacements, is to first think about, could this be a part of just charge syndrome? Could this be a part of their behavioral phenotype, the way they have experienced the world, and that we need to provide supports to understand that. So thinking about vision and hearing and seating and all of those things that you learn from the other modules, how do those impact that individual on a day-to-day basis? The other thing that I think we first need to consider is, are we ruling out pain? If this behavior is brand new, it's atypical, and it's significant enough that we're looking at it, is this child experiencing a painful episode? And what might we need to do to problem solve that? And that could be a discussion with the family. That could be a discussion with that individual. That could be as simple as tracking that behavior over time and even considering a quick check at the doctor's office to make sure that the child's doing okay. And then if we've ruled out those things, what we're looking at is ongoing assessment and intervention. So how can we assess the various environments this individual is in, and then how can we implement preventative measures and interventions in place in those environments to help support the outcome for that individual. So this is a great time to get behavioral specialists involved, folks who are very good at reading the environment and that child's behavior and comparing and contrasting that different data to be able to piece apart what function is this behavior serving and how could we change up that function in the current environment. So with doing that, one of the behavioral approaches that we consider is applied behavior analysis. And that is a theory behind why we believe behavior happens and how we learn behavior. It is a lens really that is the view of behaviors and their relationship with the environment. So those two can never be separated. We're always in some type of an environment that influences our behavioral or outcomes, whether that's people in that environment or even just the setting itself. If I was sitting in a very hot office and giving this presentation, it's likely to impact the ability of how I would best give my behavior in this talk. So we have to think about how those behaviors correlate, that all behavior occurs for a reason and that all behavior is learned. Once we have that in place, then we want to think about how we can change behavior. And so this is the big picture piece, is there are primarily 4 ways to change behavior. We can reinforce it or we can punish it. When we want to increase behavior, we want to do reinforcement. When we want to decrease behavior, we do punishment. And you might think of this as something like a consequence, and that's not really what these terms mean. What these terms mean, if you look at the graph, would be if the future outcome of the behavior that we want to change is to increase that behavior. So maybe this is appropriate social skills. Of course, we want to increase that behavior. Then we're looking at the reinforcement pattern. If the future outcome of the behavior is to decrease that pattern of behavior, then we're looking at our pattern for punishment. Now, the consequence of the behavior is what comes right after that behavior has occurred. So if we go back to that math lesson and the teacher presents the math lesson in front of me and I immediately rip the paper in half and throw it on the floor, you have added a stimulus that I don't like, I shred it up, and that outcome is what comes next after that. Do you take it away or do you give me another math sheet back? And ideally what would happen is you'd give me another math sheet back and give me reinforcement for doing that math sheet appropriately. If I was able to shred it, throw it on the floor and escape that math worksheet, the outcome is that I've been highly reinforced by that behavior and I withdrew it, and that's negative reinforcement. It's going to make it much less likely that I'm going to want to continue to do that behavior in the future. So our goal for any modification of behavior is that we're using positive reinforcement. We're adding a stimuli that's going to increase the likelihood of that behavior. So this can be thought of in a number of different ways, but this could be adding praise to a child, and making that praise statement lets them know that you are interested in engaging in that behavior in the future. So if my daughter holds my hand when we're about to cross the street, I praise her and say, "Thank you so much for holding Mama's hand while we cross the street. I really like when you hold my hand." And we do high fives and tickles after we cross the street. That becomes very motivating compared to if I said, don't cross the street, and shouted at her, and she didn't know what the expectation was to cross the street. So we want to make sure that we're adding positive pieces of reinforcement in. So the big piece that is always should be at the forefront is there should be no need to go to punishment. If we want to modify a behavior or teach a new behavior, even if that's to teach the child the word or sign for pain, we want to use positive reinforcement to do that. And there should be no need for us to have to go farther down that list. And if we do, we should really have the support of a behavioral professional to help us do that. And that's best protection for the child, but also it's the fastest and most efficient way for us to be able to teach a child new skills is by using positive reinforcement. So let's think about those ABCs, the behavior. And this is a way for us to kind of look at our environment and make those connections. So first, the antecedent is what triggers that behavior. It's the thing that comes right before it. So the teacher delivers me the worksheet. The B, or behavior, is what happens exactly that I do or this child does to engage in that behavior. So if the teacher hands me the worksheet and I rip it, the behavior is ripping the worksheet. The consequence is what happens right after that. So if the consequence is that the teacher takes away the worksheet and says, you don't have to do it, I've been highly reinforced in the future to rip that behavior or rip that sheet of paper, so I will escape from that worksheet. So again, we have a very clear function. I want to escape from the worksheet, and I have a pattern of reinforcement that was probably unintended by the teacher. She would actually like me to complete the worksheet. So what we need to build in is a functionally equivalent behavior. Is from the get-go at the antecedent piece is what can we do to prevent that behavior from happening in the first place. So if I'm going to engage in ripping the behavior, perhaps what I do is I come over as the teacher and say, you only have to do 2 of the 20 problems today. Once you're done with that, you can go play on the tablet in the classroom. That might be really reinforcing for me to get access to my tablet, and I get to escape 18 other problems on my worksheet. Child sits down, does the 2 problems, and is able to get access to the tablet. We got 2 more problems done than we would have had done otherwise, and the child avoided the problem behavior. It avoided changing up the stimuli of the environment for everybody else, and we were able to move forward. So our key focus in looking at antecedents, behaviors, and consequences is not how we change necessarily a consequence piece, but how do we prevent from even having that problem behavior happen in the first place. And so that's changing the antecedents in our environment. And that should really be our focus for challenging behavior. And back to that pain discussion, the antecedent in the environment may be to say, we're going to identify pain. And once we identify that painful experience and treated it, the behavior piece completely disappears after that. So that's the first part of that antecedent piece. And when I gave the recommendations previously of what to consider when you first see problem behaviors pop up, is what are you going to target in terms of those antecedents? And to keep in mind, if behavior continues to happen, it is still somehow being reinforced. Reinforcement doesn't have to be positive, it doesn't have to be pretty, but it can be that if that pattern keeps happening, it's being reinforced. So even if we're thinking about that pattern being related to pain, or if that pattern's related to something else, we want to be mindful of what those outcomes are, and that means we need to change something about the environment to make this better or make it improve. So what do you do with all this information when you see potential pain or you see potential problem behaviors? First thing is to find out what's the function of the behavior and what could be maintaining that challenging behavior that exists, whether it looks like anxiety or stress or pain, or it just looks like the child doesn't want to engage in whatever it is that we're trying to get them to do. Find out the function to gain access or get away from something. If we need to prevent that behavior from happening, don't give attention or access to tangibles for that behavior. And we call that extinction, sort of removing the opportunity to have access to those things the child might enjoy for engaging in that behavior. Next, we want to find appropriate replacement behaviors. So what are functionally equivalent behaviors that we could teach instead? Obviously, if that problem behavior is a result of pain, Our goal is to teach a more functionally equivalent behavior, which is to self-report that painful experience to us. But if it's a challenging behavior that's a result of something else in the environment, our goal is to prevent that and make clear what was the reason why they were doing that, so we can establish interventions surrounding that. And that replacement behavior can be really valuable. And if you think about anything we say no or don't do, that is actually wasted breath for us. Let's not focus on what to not do, but focus on what is specifically you want the child to do. And that tells you what you need to teach next for that child to be successful. Lastly, I just want to cover some of your behavioral goals or things to consider when you're putting in together a plan or hope to change problem behaviors. Is what do you want to see? Make sure that's very clear and positive. How do you get there? What resources do you need? What resources does the child need? How does vision and hearing need to be impacted by that? What changes in the environment might be necessary to make sure this child can be successful in doing that? And what else do I need to know about this student? And I hope all of our other modules help to guide you to understand those goals that I can't cover in this brief amount of time. But I think as you watch through all of these modules, you'll get a greater picture of what charge syndrome looks like and how you might need to modify other things in the environment to be successful. And then just think about the skill that I'm hoping to teach, or this replacement behavior we hope to have instead of challenging behavior, or the way that we want to better identify pain for this child. Any one of those scenarios is just kind of think about, if this child were 5 years older or 10 years older, would this still be the best way to teach this skill, and would it be age appropriate? And if you don't think it works for 5 years from now, perhaps it takes a moment to step back and go, how are we going to change this over time so the child can be successful as they age, and consider them through the lifespan to be successful with the skill that we're teaching? And I think that just allows us to step back and make sure our plan is really designed to generalize and provide the best outcomes as long as possible. So I think that brings us to a close for this part of the module. Again, thinking about when challenging behaviors exist, they can exist for a number of reasons. But if you first want to think about it as, let's make sure pain is not a significant concern for the result of this challenging behavior. How could this be a part of perhaps charge syndrome in general, and what we might need to consider for this individual? But then also, if this is just strictly a challenging behavior and we need to more appropriately teach a different socially appropriate response, are we trying to escape something, or are we trying to get access to something? And that allows us to start that intervention path. And don't ever be afraid to consult with behavioral professionals who might be able to help you along that way. So in closing, thank you so much for allowing me to be a part of your learning experience about charge syndrome. It's such a pleasure to work with the families that I get to work with and learn about this population. And hopefully this provides you with some insight of future areas of research that we need, and also other areas that we hope to dive into very soon, and have your support for that. Thank you so much.